Kalimera and welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid A-Level Greeks. It's winter, so the sun's not shining, it's pretty rainy and miserable outside, and today we're going to look at the first half of the Persian Wars of 480 BC. As with previous videos on the Persian Wars and the course up to this point, we're not going to look specifically at the particular details. So if you're expecting an exciting discussion about the details of the Battle of Thermopylae, you're not going to get that, because those kind of things have been dealt with in far more detail and far more humorously on the GCSE Persians videos. What we're going to look at today is more of an overview, and particularly looking at the idea of Greek relations and how they play out during this war. So previously on Stupid A-Level Greeks, we've looked at the preparations the Greeks made before Xerxes' mass invasion in 480. We've looked at things like the creation of the Hellenic League, this uneasy alliance between Athens and Sparta, with Sparta at the lead, and how they thought they were going to fight the Persians. We've also looked at Themistocles' role in building an Athenian navy, which they saw as one of their main weaknesses. So now we're ready, we're going to look at the key events that happen once Xerxes actually does invade Greece. So let's start with invasion. So in 480, Xerxes, with Mardonius, his kind of general and right-hand man, the guy whose plan basically this is, Xerxes crosses the Hellespont with his army of all Asia. They're following this northern route established early by Mardonius. His massive land army of over 1 million men, apparently, obviously we've got to be wary of figures, is also tracked by a huge navy. So it's a combined invasion. They're coming by land and by sea. And again, although this is arguably the long way round through Greece, if their ultimate aim is Athens and Sparta, it's quite a sensible approach. Xerxes has a lot of men that he can't really fit on boats. But also, by using this northern route, he can use places like Thrace and Macedonia, which have relatively recently been brought in under Persian control. He can use them as staging areas, and we know he had huge supply bases to keep his army going. Once Xerxes crosses the Hellespont and arguably into Europe, the Greeks decide to act quite quickly to stop him before he reaches southern Greece. This is interesting because it does bring out some of these old divisions in how the Greeks viewed the Greek world, particularly this idea of the north-south divide. The southern Greeks, Athens and Sparta, largely saw Macedonia and northern Greece as kind of wild barbarian lands, not properly Greek, even though they were Greek. So there's a clear north-south divide. So the Hellenic forces, the Hellenic League, they amass a significant force, and they marched north to fight at a place called Tempe or Therme, depending on which translation of Herodotus you use it. They think this is going to be an ideal place to fight. The mountainous terrain offers them some narrow passes that they can easily blockade, where hoplite warfare will play into their advantage, and the Persian numbers have to be funneled through, which makes their numbers pretty useless. So they march north and they arrive at where they think the battle's going to be. But then they're told that actually this is really not a good place to fight. There is a way around this mountain path, so they could quite easily be exposed from behind. So Tempe, Therme is a battle that never really happens. It's a good example of strategic thinking on the Greeks' part. But yeah, it never really happens. It's not the right place. So once they realise this, the Hellenic forces, before fighting the Persians, they retreat south. Now this effectively then abandons northern Greece, places like Thessaly, to Xerxes. So again, not only does it tell us a little bit about how the Greeks intend to fight this war, but also that they're quite happy just to abandon large chunks of northern Greece to Persia, because again, they don't really see it as proper Greece. So as the Persian juggernaut continues to move through Greece, heading further and further south, we see it's Sparta who take the first action of the war. And there are two main reasons for this, ultimately. The first being that we see Sparta are clearly desperate to regain some of their standing after their, shall we say, less than glowing performance at Marathon, basically not turning up. The second is that, again, prior to this whole kicking off, the Spartans receive an oracle which runs along the lines roughly that a king will die or Sparta will fall. Now obviously the Spartans are hoping this means Xerxes, but the idea that Sparta will fall really sends some kind of shockwaves into Sparta, and it actually kicks them into gear to do something about this. But, as always, there's a problem. Xerxes is invading early September, which is handily enough just when Carnea is being celebrated, so we get a repetition of what happened at Marathon. But this is, again, slightly different. Because of these two aforementioned reasons, what we see is Leonidas, the king of Sparta, sidesteps the diktat that during Carnea the Spartan army cannot leave Sparta, and he famously marches north with his personal bodyguard of 300 men. Arguably some of his best men, as the story goes. They're all survived by living sons, and these are his chosen few. So as the Spartans march north to what is Thermopylae, which becomes the famous battlefield, they're joined by an amalgamated force of Peloponnesians and Thebans, roughly about 5,000 troops altogether. Obviously, importantly, including apparently 13 Locrian troops. I mean, those 13 guys make all the difference. So they head north into Malice to a place called Thermopylae, Greek for hot gates. And this is what they see as the ideal place to fight the Persians. As with Tempe or Thermae, it's a very, very narrow pass that they can blockade, they can hold off the Persians, they can funnel this giant army into this narrow pass where effectively their numbers don't count. It's a coastal region, so on one side you've got the mountains, on the other side you've got the sea. And also there's an ancient Phocian wall that was there. It's pretty much in ruin, but they go and they rebuild this wall that starts forming the basis of their defence line. So this arguably for them is the best place, the best opportunity they will have to fend off Xerxes' army of 1,000,000, even with such a relatively small force. Now in terms of Greek relations, what's interesting here is this is a good example of Sparta now taking its responsibility as the leader of Greece quite seriously. Obviously they've got their own self-interests to worry about, but Sparta are actually leading the Hellenic League despite the kind of religious laws that are laid down that they have to follow. The Spartans are notoriously pious, but they're taking action, they're doing something about this Persian invasion. So off they march, off to Thermopylae, ready to fight the Persians. And then to battle. Now, like I said, I'm not going to go through the ins and outs of the battle in much detail here. Again, it's far more humorously covered in the Persians podcast on Thermopylae. What we're going to look at is the significance to the wider Greek world and the bigger narrative of the period study. So, we get to Thermopylae, and as expected, this combined force of hardy Greeks holds off the Persian forces for a good few days, despite Xerxes' best attempts. And by best attempts, we basically mean Xerxes shouting at his men to go and attack until they come back in pieces. We're told at various points he leaps up from where he's sitting. He cannot strategically handle failure, it seems, at this point. What's also interesting, if we look at the kind of reasons for Xerxes' overall defeat, is there's no mention of Persian cavalry at Thermopylae. Given that the cavalry are meant to be kind of Persia's most lauded troops, along with the immortals, that's their key weapon, they don't actually seem to use it very much. Maybe they're just saving it for later. It could also be that the terrain at Thermopylae in this narrow pass means that horses, cavalry, would be pretty useless. Either way, Xerxes spends a day or two throwing everything and the kitchen sink at the Greeks, and because of the nature of hoplite warfare, because of the armour, because of their plan, they're able to resist this, so you get an effective stalemate. This then changes when Ephialtes reveals to Xerxes that there's actually an ancient goat path behind the mountain that will bring them out behind the Greek positions. Again, this is very dramatic. This could not be more Greek tragedy if you tried. It's all about betrayal and so on, but it also gives us a good idea about Greek relations, that we need to emphasize that not everyone is absolutely committed to fighting the Persians. Ephialtes certainly sees a way to make some cash out of this, and he does. We don't know the exact details, but it's a fair assumption that Xerxes rewards him handsomely. So again, if in this situation someone is going to be betrayed, it's likely it's going to be the Greeks selling out the other Greeks. So Ephialtes reveals the mountain path. The Greek scouts find out that the Persians are coming over the mountain. 10,000 immortals probably hiding behind one bush. It's not going to be hard to spot them. And knowing the battle is effectively now lost, Leonidas dismisses the rest of the Greeks. According to the sources, this is because he doesn't want them to die. He's saving them for another day. But we can also see it as a degree of Spartan glory hunting. The Spartans have gone there to do what Sparta are supposed to do, fight gloriously to the death. It's also worth pointing out here as well that it's not just the Spartan 300 that stay to the very bitter end. Also staying is the Thespian contingent, but also the Thebans, who are described as hostages or prisoners, that Leonidas doesn't trust them, so instead he keeps them there. Now with this is a really important point to make in terms of Greek relations. This is most likely an example of Herodotus's kind of pro-Athenian perspective. Given that Thebes later Medize and they have a long-standing animosity with Athens, this can explain why they sort of get this negative review, that they're instantly sold out as traitors and hostages, and Leonidas doesn't trust them. Practicalities-wise, it'd be difficult to keep 400 people hostage when you have less men than them. So we can probably say this one example, Herodotus's description of the Thebans, is most likely to be this kind of pro-Athenian sentiment that we see, partially based because of his sources are primarily Athenian, and we do know that Herodotus is writing his work in Athens, presumably with the Athenian state supporting him. So there's a degree of subjectivity in his recording of certain events, even though he's trying to stay balanced. Which brings us to the heroic last stand at the Battle of Thermopylae, and we're told that once surrounded, the Spartans form up for their last stand, the Greeks form up for their last stand, and are overwhelmed by missile weapons. Again, we can see this as the Greeks having a bit of a dig at the Persians, that they weren't brave enough to come and fight the Greeks hand to hand. They had to use bows and arrows, which traditionally are not really a Greek thing in war. So again, it's a bit of a slight at the Persians, overcome by missile weapons. On the other hand, we have this elaborate description of the Spartans fighting, to quote, with fingers and teeth. So they're literally fighting tooth and nail to the death. And again, arguably this is more an exercise in kind of pro-Spartan dramatisation, pro-Greek propaganda than a factually accurate account. Although, who's to say if the battle was going that desperately, maybe you would just fight and bite as much as you could. Either way, Herodotus' account stands the test of time. Once the battle is over, Leonidas' body is taken and it's decapitated by Xerxes, and this causes outrage across the Greek world. But even though Xerxes thinks he's showing he's won and he's trying to terrify the Greeks, it kind of has the negative effect. It highlights the importance of Thermopylae to the Greeks, and particularly to the Spartans. We have this situation where Leonidas and the Spartans have sacrificed everything. They've become martyrs to the Greek cause, to the Hellenic League, and they act as a way of motivating the rest of Greece. Certainly there's a few thousand really angry Spartans who are not pleased that their king's been decapitated. They need little motivation. But for the rest of Greece, again, think about the terms of the Hellenic League. There's no room for manoeuvre, and now the bar is set very, very high for anyone in the Hellenic League. There's no excuse now to put life and limb on the line and give everything in the defence of Greece, because the argument is, look at Leonidas, look at the Spartans, this is the level to which people have committed to this fight. You can't just change your mind halfway through. So even though Xerxes has won the Battle of Thermopylae, he has not won it well, and he knows this. Doesn't help that the Greeks are also celebrating the losses as heroes. So Xerxes has to do something to address this. So the first thing he does is he hurriedly buries the Persian dead. We're told of him digging mass graves, covering them with leaves, doing anything he can to try and cover up his losses. Because again, he can't really seem like the great and powerful invader if there's piles of dead Persians lying around after finding such a small number of Greeks. The Greek bodies he does leave on display, and he invites locals from the surrounding areas to come and look at what he's done to their great warriors, again hoping to break up the Greek resolve, break up the Hellenic League, and get more to capitulate. Unfortunately for Xerxes, the locals are not convinced. Apparently they see these piles of Persians, or they see these hurriedly dug graves, especially if he's just been putting leaves on the bodies. That's not going to fool anyone. And also with the displayed Greeks, the Greeks themselves know these are not all Spartans. They know that these are other Greeks as well. Don't forget, some of the Greeks in the region will have seen the vast majority of the Greek force retreat. So they know Xerxes is spinning them a line. They know he's claiming more than is actually the case, and it's not turning out to be the great PR propaganda exercise he thinks it's going to be. So Xerxes then, keeping with a similar line, trying to break the Greek resolve, decides that he's going to demoralise them by taking Delphi. Delphi is in the region, and it's also one of the most sacred sites in all of Greece. It's where the oracles live, it's got special regard, and Xerxes thinks that if he can take Delphi, the Greeks will think that the gods have abandoned the Greeks. This is his plan. Unfortunately for Xerxes, this does not go well. So we get various grand statements about what happens. The Persians are marching up Mount Parnassus to the temple at Delphi, when there's either a landslide or a rock slide and some lightning, probably a storm, or again, as Herodotus likes to describe it, giant stone hoplites come out of the mountain and start trashing the Persians. Either way, the attack on Delphi does not work well. Xerxes' desire to break the Greeks' resolve fails miserably, and he's left probably more and more frustrated. We should point out here, though, that after the Battle of Thermopylae, there is a little light at the end of the tunnel for Xerxes, in that Thebes do Medize. They are very geographically close to Thermopylae, so Xerxes is now a real threat. The rest of the Greeks have retreated further back south, so they Medize. Again, if you're to follow Herodotus's line of argument, this is because they were always going to Medize, and they were always going to be traitors to the Hellenic League. The problem we have with that is obviously treating a city-state as a homogeneous entity, assuming that everyone in Thebes thinks the same way. It's likely in Thebes that opinion was split between the people whether to Medize or to fight, in a similar way to what we saw in Eretria, where most of the city wanted to repel the Persians, but then those two guys opened the gates and it all ended terribly. It seems like that the Thebans at Thermopylae probably represented the side of the city that wanted to fight, that wanted to give it their all, that wanted to repel the Persians, and once they died, you see the group in Thebes that wanted to Medize as being the kind of the dominant voice in Thebes, and this then leads to Medization. I think it's probably fair to say that Herodotus's view that the Thebans couldn't be trusted and they were always going to betray the Greeks is a little excessive. So Thermopylae, done and dusted. Delphi, done and dusted. But meanwhile, particularly just after the Battle of Thermopylae, a combined Greek fleet is anchored just at the Straits of Artemisium. If you look at the map that's on the screen, you'll see it's just off the coast of Thermopylae and effectively act as the naval branch to the blockade. Thermopylae being the land blockade, Artemisium becoming the naval blockade. And they are under the command of a Spartan by the name of Eurybiades. Now, Eurybiades, either upon hearing the outcome of Thermopylae or seeing that there's no reasonable victory to be had, he decides he's going to retreat back to the Isthmus of Corinth, and he starts making preparations to do this. Again, the details of the reasoning is speculative because Herodotus. Now, this retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth is not uncommon. This is a bit of an overall Spartan strategy to save the Peloponnese. The Isthmus of Corinth is a very good place to fight off the Persians. It's a very thin landmass between the Peloponnese and Attica, so it's easy to blockade and barricade. It's just north of Corinth, so you've got a good base in which to repel the Persians from. It also highlights that Sparta ultimately, and this is not just during the Persian Wars, we've seen this earlier with the Ionian Revolt, that Sparta really are quite isolationist. Themselves and the Peloponnesian League exist purely to defend their grip on the Peloponnese. To some extent you could say that they're not going to be too bothered if the rest of Greece burns, as long as the Peloponnese is fine. Now, this is one flaw in the Hellenic League that is very difficult to overcome when you've got the vast bulk of members on this little peninsula effectively safe from harm, and you're trying to encourage them to move out of their safe zone, out of their defensive position, and help the rest of Greece. So Eurybiades begins making preparations to retreat. Now, not too happy about this, the local people approach the leader of the Athenian contingent of this force, a little guy called Themistocles. We've heard about him before, and they approach him with a bribe. And why not? What we know of Themistocles, if you want him to do something, a bribe's probably a good way to go. So, moral character aside, Themistocles takes the bribe from the locals, but in turn uses a chunk of the money to bribe Eurybiades to stay. This raises some questions at how you bribe someone from a state that doesn't look favourably on money, but either way, he bribes Eurybiades to stay. Eurybiades agrees and effectively hands over control of the fleet to Themistocles. So this is an interesting counterpoint. Wherever we've seen Thermopylae as being Spartan leadership, arguably at its finest, flying headfirst into the jaws of death, here we see a kind of, on one hand, more strategic view of Spartan leadership, or something else that occurs throughout the period, a weakness in Spartan leadership. The fact that Sparta are not keen to act unless it's entirely in their best interest. There are other events throughout the period where you see Spartan inaction becomes a bit of an issue. The leadership becomes, for want of a better word, flaccid. They're not keen to act despite everyone else's, not demands, but appeals to do so. So again, Eurybiades hands over control of this combined force and to Themistocles, but not just hands over control, he also hands over any glory that will come from a victory. So it's a bit of an own goal if you think Sparta are desperately trying to claw back their reputation from not turning up at Marathon. Yes, they've done that with Thermopylae, but equally now you've got Eurybiades just handing over control to an Athenian. So Themistocles starts to make preparations to engage the oncoming Persian fleet, and he does so in these narrow straits of Artemisium. Effectively, think of it like Thermopylae at sea. Narrow pass, huge Persian numbers, small Greek force. And as we'll see later on in the periods, Themistocles' cunning and his strategy really takes the foreground here. So Themistocles knows he has got no hope of completely stopping the Persians. He's fighting a significantly larger force, and half of them have taken a different route and are not actually coming through the Straits of Artemisium. So he can't defeat them, but what he does intend to do is disrupt them. So as he gets word that the Persians are now entering the Straits of Salamis, he forms his ships into a tight cyclo, or circle, it's Greek for circle, and they take up the strait. A cyclo, in this sense, think of it literally like lashing together the tail pieces of all of his triremes, so they form effectively a naval hedgehog. All the pointy ends are pointing out. It's like a circle of brass rams. It's very difficult for the Persians to get in between these ships unless putting themselves at great risk. So the Persians advance down the strait and they see this cyclo, and they think, right, this is the Greeks forming a simple defensive manoeuvre to stop us destroying them. So they see this as not really a threat, potential threat, but they see the Greeks almost as cowering. So they decide they're going to advance through. So as the Persians start to reach the cyclo and start to even sail around the edges of this cyclo, because Themistocles has left them room on either side, once the Persians are close enough, Themistocles breaks this formation open. It's like an explosion, and these Athenian triremes, these fast, light, manoeuvrable ships, propel themselves outward and into the weak defensive sides of the Persian ships. This causes carnage for the ships that are hit. It causes significant damage to a lot of ships, sinks others, but more importantly disrupts the Persian advance through the Straits of Artemisium. What they thought was going to be a nice little sail through a narrow channel just to back up the army on land has turned out quite different. The disruption and the damage that it's caused sends a bit of a shock into the Persian forces. It's also really important because it now shows, Themistocles is showing the Persians that the Greeks are not as weak when it comes to naval combat as they once were, and as possibly the Persians were thinking they would be. So it's not a decisive victory. There is significant disruption, and the Greeks have drawn Persian blood. So after this brief melee, the Greeks then retreat further south. Unlike Thermopylae, the majority of this Greek force has survived, and they're sailing south to fight another day. Themistocles, though, takes one of his fastest ships and heads off in front of them. He has a plan. What Themistocles does is he stops at all the little bays and harbours and beaches and inlets where he knows the Persians are likely to stop on their way south. They will need rest, they will need to make contact with the land forces, they'll need to stop at various points. And he makes sure he stops there first. And when he does stop, he carves a message into the rock-faced walls, into the cliff sides, addressing the Ionian members of the Persian navy. Don't forget that a large chunk of the Persian navy were Ionian Greeks. And he writes this message in Greek. This comes important later on. The message reads along the lines that the Ionians should remember that they are Greek, and in the future battles that are coming, they should either run away, join their Greek brothers, or fight so poorly to be ineffective. So he's trying to do what Xerxes was trying to do. He's trying to jab a wedge in the Persian forces. It's interesting as well that he's appealing to a shared sense of Greekness that hasn't really manifested yet in terms of the 5th century. What we've seen is lots of Greeks arguing with each other, but no acknowledgement that they are all ultimately Greeks. Either way, this is a win-win situation for Themistocles, because it plays to all of his advantages. If the Ionian Greeks heed his message, brilliant, happy days, there are less people to fight, or they'll fight so poorly that it won't be a problem. It may well sow the seed of doubt in some of these Greek leaders, so they may not, best will in the world, they may not fight as fiercely as they would normally, because again, Themistocles has sowed this seed of you're actually betraying your brothers, you are a traitor to your people. And even more so, if the Ionians tell the Persians what it says, bear in mind it's written in Greek, this even more so will sow the seed of doubt in the Persians about the loyalty of these Ionians. Can they trust them? Are they going to heed Themistocles' message? Let's face it, the Ionians and Greeks generally have a history of turning on their previous masters or on each other. It's happened before with the Ionian revolt, so why wouldn't it happen again? So even if the Persians are aware of the message Themistocles has written quite clearly, it will sow this seed of doubt, and it's unlikely that they would give their best sailors, the Greeks, key roles in upcoming battles because of this. It's almost like he's intentionally sowing the seed of doubt in the Persian minds. So this done, it's like early psychological warfare. He's making them doubt what's going to happen before it even happens. And once he's done that, he heads back straight to Athens, where the Greeks can now prepare for the next stage in this Persian War. So, in summary, these first opening conflicts of the Persian War of 480 lay bare some issues that are quite important to the kind of approach to Greek relations. The first one we've got to look at is that Sparta, on one hand, are very keen to regain their reputation. They're trying to claw back any kind of public face loss they've had after Marathon. So on one hand, they're desperately trying to regain their standing. But equally, just at the same time, if not a day later, they're equally as ready to hand over difficult tasks to the Athenians, which allows the Athenians to kind of further capitalise on their self-propagandising. This is obviously quite a critical view of Sparta, but again, given what comes later, you can see the seeds of this kind of approach throughout. And again, yes, we've got to be very careful that a lot of the sources are Athenian based and will view the Athenians as significantly better, but the fact of the matter is that Eurybiades hands over control to Themistocles. The next thing that we see emerging is this idea of betrayal, possibly the most Greek of dramatic devices. Greek drama is littered with this idea of traitors and betrayal. The obvious one here is Ephialtes. He's self-serving. He will sell out his fellow countrymen to get further ahead himself. He does it for his own gain. We could also look at Ephialtes and say, well, again, it speaks to a large number of Greeks at the time who probably didn't see the Persians as that significant a threat. They didn't see much threat to their personal being or their way of life by the coming of the Persians. Again, we've got these relatively friendly, quite threatening but friendly demands for earth and water. For most Greeks, not much would change. Again, with the idea of betrayal, we've got the treatment of thieves. In the sources, given Herodotus' kind of pro-Athenian stance, the fact that the Athenians are effectively bankrolling him, and the Athenians' view of Thebes, this is probably a bit harsh, but again, it's this idea of betrayal. Think back to the causes of the Hellenic League. Treachery equals death. It gives Athens another reason, even post-war, to kind of call out Thebes for being traitors, whether they intended from the beginning to betray, or whether it was circumstance, or the fact that the rest of the Greeks had just abandoned them, is up for discussion. But again, Thebes seen as betrayers. The other thing we need to look at is again this ongoing idea of the Thucydides Trap, which marks the whole period. Athens' star keeps rising. They are continually pushing themselves to the front. They are becoming more and more a force to be reckoned with and a force to be recognised in Greece. Although Artemisium is nowhere near as famous as Thermopylae in the Greek world or even now, it's still really, really important. Artemisium ultimately lays bare some of these contradictions in the Greek world more than Thermopylae. Thermopylae is the heroic last stand, whereas Artemisium is actually more business as usual and highlights these tensions. It's also obvious that Themistocles is becoming more and more an important individual in this conflict. Again, if we're looking at another theme that emerges throughout the period, it's to what extent do individuals play significant roles in shaping the events that happen. The ability to fight wars or make peace, dependent on who's calling the shots at the time. Again, looking at reasons for Xerxes' defeat, it's very clear after Artemisium that the Greek leadership, and also Xerxes' inability to crack Thermopylae with any cool plan, it's clear that Greek leadership really is outstripping the Persian high command. The Greeks are winning this war intellectually, their strategy is more adaptable, they are thinking about how they fight the war rather than taking the Persian approach, which is simply to throw everything at the enemy. So there you have it, a quick overview of the first half of the Persian Wars of 480 BC. Hopefully this has been useful. As always, leave us a comment below, and until next time, goodbye.